Hello and welcome everybody. We're thrilled you could join us. I'm Julian Bajkowski, Senior Journalist at the Mandarin. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. We're on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any First Nations people in the audience today. Well, today I'm joined by David Hazlehurst, Chief Executive of Services Australia and one of the Australian Public Service's most experienced and proficient performers. We've had hundreds of questions, so let's start with a bit of a backdrop and an update that will answer a lot of those before we get into specifics. David, what have you been doing for the past year?
Well, thank you, Julian, and hello to everyone. I'm very glad to be joining you today from gorgeous Ngunnawal country, looking out over the landscape here and reflecting on the ongoing custodianship of the land here of the Ngunnawal people. I've had a wonderful year. In fact, I've had 18 months. It's only just ticked over 18 months. It's been a start that's involved a lot of learning, a lot of listening, a lot of engagement inside the organisation and outside, including getting around to every state and territory and meeting a lot with staff and stakeholders. Naturally enough, it's been a year of making progress too. We were very fortunate to receive an injection of funding from the government the beginning of last year and then confirmed in the budget, which enabled us to really get back on track in terms of meeting people's expectations and meeting our expectations of ourselves, which was really terrific. And it's been, it's been an 18 months for me that's also involved working with the organisation about, well, what next? And so really thinking about how we engage with continuous improvement, how we, beyond just getting back on track with processing claims and answering phones, what's next? And so we're pretty excited about those next steps for us, yeah.
So one of the things that I understand that you've been doing is listening a fair bit and going on stakeholder consultations. How has stakeholder consultation changed under your leadership, and what's changed and what needed to change?
Yeah, look, the stakeholders themselves haven't sort of turned over or anything. So we've had a continuous and ongoing engagement with a range of stakeholders. What I would say about that is two things. And we use a bit of an expression. We've talked a lot in the organisation about bringing the outside in. And that was in response to a sense that we needed to really rebuild trust, including after Robodebt. And we've had to do that in a way that is really about being super open. Like many government agencies, we've often been criticised in the past for sort of, well, thinking about a problem, coming up with the solutions, and then consulting. And so rather than sort of engaging with people after the concrete's been mixed or even poured, we've really changed our approach to try and be really open from the beginning. And that's been quite a change for us. It's a real challenge for us to think about, well, how would we engage before we know what the answer is, or even before we fully identified the problem or described the problem. But it's enabled us, I think, to engage with a different way with our stakeholders. We've also had the Ministerial Independent Advisory Board that's been established, which has been a new feature for us. So we've always had other mechanisms like our community engagement forums, but this was new. And so a group of experts chaired by Victor Dominello, but including people like Carolyn Edwards, Leanne Ho, Ed Santo, Simon Longstaff, to really challenge us and support the Minister with advice to the Minister. The examples of the sorts of things, I'm happy to talk about them in more detail, but examples of specific projects, if you like, we've engaged people on differently has been response to Robodebt around vulnerability, really engaging people openly and early in how we might do things better. Things like the Centerpay reforms, which are coming to a sort of climax in terms of some actual decisions and moving into implementation. And an approach to, we've also been doing quite a lot of work on our approach to community engagement. How do we get out into community? And I guess that's probably, if I was to say there's an outside in dimension, there's also an inside out dimension. So, and that's really about saying, we've always been part of the community in which we operate, but over time, and not just in the last 18 months, we've increasingly been connecting out into community through stakeholders to those who would not otherwise engage with us. So people who perhaps the most vulnerable or have the most complex needs, who won't ring us, who won't engage online, and who won't come into a service centre. So that kind of engagement is something that we're continuing to pivot towards. We have about 1,400 social workers and specialist officers who are engaged out into community, and we have about 10,000 relationships out into the community. And that's a little bit different. So that's not engaging with community organisations or peaks around policy change or service delivery change. It's actually to help one person at a time, and then the next person, and then the next person, a person who might not otherwise engage with us.
Sorry, I'll mute myself. That outreach is actually a pretty big change. And without getting into the politics, there was a perception over the last decade that Centrelink, Human Services, then Services Australia, developed a bit of a culture of what you could call punitive welfare that ultimately manifested in Robodebt. And then there was a Royal Commission, and we all know what's happened since. No reason to dwell on that for too long, but what cultural values have you put in place to safeguard against Robo 2.0?
Yeah, sure. That's obviously been a big focus for the organisation, not just in the last 18 months, but well before that. And look, I'd say a few things. The first thing I'd say is we're never going to forget the lessons of Robodebt. The need for us to serve the public with respect and compassion and empathy. But equally, we also want to have a speak up culture within the place. And look, the third lesson about acting lawfully and ethically, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but those are the, from my perspective, just to put it in a nutshell, the clear lessons of Robodebt. And what I would say about all of those is there'll always be a work in progress. You know, we're not declaring victory. We're very much seeing ourselves as on a journey rather than having reached a destination, or put another metaphor out there. But I would say, Julian, when I first got here, I was really struck about the extent to which the organisation was deeply connected to purpose. And by that, I mean deeply connected to serving the people of Australia. And I know that sounds a bit melodramatic or whatever, over the top, but it's true. You feel it when you get out and about in Services Australia, and particularly when you're connecting with our staff on the ground, you feel it deeply. And I do want to also acknowledge and really pay credit to the work of others before me, and Rebecca Skinner and the team well before me, the creation of the master plan, which had this very strong and now deeply embedded vision for the place around simple, helpful, respectful, transparent services that help Australians get on with their lives. Our people in the latest census, 93% of them connect with that. And I guess, you know, that's just a number at one level, but I felt it really deeply. What I did observe and what people said to me when I first got here was we still had a bit of a tendency to be closed. We still had a bit of a tendency to be defensive. I mean, it was partly a function of the place being a bit under siege. And so if I was to say what was something new that we've been particularly leading into, it would be around openness, curiosity, confidence. But for example, when we're criticised or the Ombudsman is concerned about something we're doing, I'm hoping now that our first reaction is to say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that, as opposed to, no, I don't think you understand. And so I feel as though that's something that we're making significant progress on, and I think it's really important. Yeah.
You mentioned before Centerpay. That's had a bit of a interesting life from its time when it was created. I mean, for those unfamiliar with Centerpay, it's a way of basically getting bills or other payments made directly from your benefit or from your government payment. David will probably explain it better, but there were some issues with it. Namely, it became exploited by fairly unscrupulous, people without morals, who miraculously turned welfare payments into shareholder dividends on some occasions. What's happening with Centerpay? What's the plan there? It doesn't sound like it's going anywhere. Fill us in.
Look, it's not going anywhere. So as you say, Julian, Centerpay is effectively a budgeting tool. Lots of people use it. There's 600,000 people who use it at the moment. It's very helpful for very many people. But stakeholders have been saying to us for some time that there was those significant concerns that you were describing around the risk to people being exploited, the risk of them not understanding where the money was going or how much money they'd actually lodged with a particular business. And this is a good example of actually, in fact, probably the one we most refer to now to build learning within the organisation, of a different way of engaging. So, the typical way of a government agency, perhaps, or perhaps at least what we would have been otherwise criticised for, would be to write a discussion paper and to send that out and get comments. And it's not that we didn't have any discussion papers, but we didn't start there. So the starting point for us was, rather than even defining the problem before we engaged, we chose to just engage. And we had a reference group that was set up with a range of groups, including Anglicare, Mobstrong, Debt Help, ACOS, Economic Justice Australia, Financial Rights. And that reference group, we met with them fortnightly for about 6 months. And it started with quite a robust conversation where we just listened. And they told us all the things that were wrong and the things that we hadn't paid sufficient attention to, and the ways in which Centerpay was doing people harm. So it was a really interesting way to start the conversation. But it started a conversation that was, I'm always reluctant to use the word co-design because it means different things to different people, and true co-design is very hard to do. But this was pretty close to co-design. It was really starting with the problem, engaging people in potential solutions, working through the trade-offs. Naturally enough, we also engaged directly out into community. So the team engaged particularly also in remote communities, which was really important thing to do. And we've also been engaging very extensively with the businesses, because there are many businesses who engage through Centerpay in ways that are extremely positive for people, as well as others where naturally there's been concern about their questionable practices. And so any change that you make to Centerpay will have implications both for the people who use it and for the businesses that engage with it. So there will be some changes. We're close to finalising some decisions around those. We've been consulting very heavily on them. They include things like, should there be limits on different types of payments? Should there be some things you can't use Centerpay for? I won't go into the details of those, but I guess the main point to say is it's involved a different approach to engaging, and I'm very proud of the team that did that engagement. Yeah.
I understand that you've also set up an advocates channel to help deliver better outcomes for customers that are experiencing vulnerability in complex circumstances. What's the go with that?
Yeah, so that came out of it was one of the recommendations flowing from the Royal Commission, the Robodebt Royal Commission. And what we've done there is we've established a mechanism for people who have a legal advocate, someone who's acting legally on their behalf, who's a lawyer, and created a way for them to be able to engage directly with us on behalf of their client, particularly clients with particularly complex circumstances and vulnerabilities. And we've used that as a mechanism to then resolve those things in a more expeditious way. So that's been very successful. And we started initially with a small group of the legal advocacy community, and we're gradually expanding that now. So yeah, no, we're really pleased with how that's going and get very positive feedback from the legal advocates that we've been engaging with.
And just sticking with customers or clients or everyday people that interact with the government, I know that there have been some critical incidents that have happened in settling offices, where staff have been harmed. Bill was visibly emotionally moved by this, and no one ever deserves to be hurt in their workplace. But the workplace has kind of changed from a branch to a digital focus over the years. But what can you tell us about how you keep a service centre or a branch welcoming, friendly, but still keeping people inside, customers and staff, safe? What's been happening there?
Yeah, sure. So to the extent there are things that keep me lying awake at night, staff safety, and particularly physical staff safety in our service centres is one of them. Particularly because we can't reduce the risk to zero. It's not possible. And the really important thing I'd say about that is, we've got about 6,300 staff in 318 service centres, and they interact with the public roughly 40,000 times a day, 10 million times a year. And the vast majority of those interactions are positive, courteous, professional, safe interactions. But with that many interactions, there are some that aren't. And it can be because people have really complex needs or they're having their worst day. It's never okay, but it does happen. And so we're about halfway through now implementing a response to a review that was done. It was done by Graham Ashton, the former Victorian Police Commissioner, after we had a terrible stabbing incident at our Airport West office in Melbourne. And the most important thing I'd say about that is we've taken a very multifaceted approach. It's no one thing that helps to keep people safe and makes that experience for people coming in both safe and welcoming. And the government really backed us in on this and invested $360 million in us over 2 years. But the kinds of things we've been doing, we've actually been transforming the physical space itself. And that does include enhanced security features, but it also has made the offices much more welcoming. Now, the best way to understand that is to go to one, but they feel and look different. They are more welcoming, and they're safer. And we've done about 185 sites are now transformed out of 318. We've still got more to go. But we've also been doing things like increased security guard presence, particularly in high-risk sites. We've upgraded security systems, including the capacity through our closed circuit TV to be able to share between service centres imagery of basically high-risk customers who've caused a problem in one centre and maybe going to the next centre. We've also had advanced customer aggression training for our staff for them to learn how to de-escalate situations that can arise. And about 3,500 staff have had that training already. It's been very positively received, and we'll get through all of them by the end of this financial year. And lastly, because it is very multifaceted, we've also had a program that the government's been supporting and the Parliament is supporting around legislative change. So increased penalties for people who assault our staff, and in fact, any Commonwealth officer, and increased protections that we can put in place to keep our people safe from a legislative perspective. But Julian, can I just say one thing about all of this? We also know that a big part of this is also about our basic performance. People get also frustrated with us when we don't do what it says on the tin, which is process claims promptly and answer the phone quickly and actually just meet their needs, let them get on with their lives. So a big thing that's happened over the last 18 months or so is that we have improved on that. And that has meant things like customer complaints, for example. In Centrelink, they've halved. In Medicare, they've gone down by over 40%. So those things make a big difference too, to the relationship that we have with people. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, well, if you spend a long time on the phone and then you find yourself going into the office, you're usually not a happy camper. But just on the office, more than a decade ago, I suppose, when it was still running, there was a conference called Security in Government, and the Chief Security Officer from Human Services gave a pretty frank kind of background presentation. And one of the main observations that I took away was that as digital and online service adoption became normalised and mainstreamed, the clients that started to present to the physical office were more likely to become more challenged and more challenging. Has that come to pass?
Let me answer that in a slightly different way. And that is to say, we've been on a long-term trend, which is reflected in those observations, which is that the number of interactions that we have with people is gradually going down, as in the face-to-face or the telephony interactions is gradually coming down, because of more people are able to self-service more easily, and because of technology. So, for example, in the olden days, staff have told me, as recently as last week, a lot of work was done in our service centres simply using a wand to scan in paper applications. We don't do that at all anymore. So what does that mean? It does mean that over time, on average, each of our interactions with a person, with people, has become more complex. So on average, the interactions that we have with people are with people with more complex needs, and therefore they're not able to self-service, or people who have a less capacity for self-service. It's not quite the same thing as saying that means they're going to be the people who are more likely to have aggression towards us. And what I'd say about that is, I'm not sure that that's changed much from anything that we've done. I think things like more like the kind of prevalence of things in the community, the prevalence of severe financial hardship or poverty, or things like mental health or substance abuse, those sorts of things are likely to be the things that increase the absolute number, if you like, of people that might engage with us where there are particularly challenging behaviours. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. Yes, more complex. We're definitely on that trend still, and it will continue. But I don't think that's the same thing as saying more challenging behaviours. What I would say is, I mentioned it earlier, over time, we're pivoting, and we have been for ages. When 92% digital interactions now. So over time, more self-service, we're more efficient in the back. That enables us to do more, to engage with people who've got complex needs, to spend more time with each of those people, including what I said earlier about the engagement out into community, to those who won't otherwise come to us, but will go to a community organisation. So if we can be present there, then we can meet their needs too.
Okay, well, stepping out of the branch and back into the digital sphere, we've been hearing and seeing varying rates of progress on digital identity for the last few years, for some of us for the last 20 years, myself included. It's finally emerging out of the scaffolding. Where would you say we are on the great road trip to make digital ID fully functional, easily usable and ubiquitous? How much friction can be eliminated? And how many more sleeps do we get there?
Well, I think it's still going to be a journey. I think there's significant progress though. So, I mean, just in terms of raw numbers, there's about 14 million Australians now with a MyID, and there's 5.1 million MyGov users who are using a digital identity as their method of accessing MyGov. I mean, the obvious point I'd make is we don't own MyID. We don't own digital identity, which is owned by finance, and MyID, of course, delivered by the ATO, is of course you well know, Julian. But we're part of the ecosystem, and I suppose what I would say about that is people will keep adopting it as they see value in it. One of the things that we have been doing in recent times is presenting to people in much the same way the banks do, almost a dashboard of your digital safety online with us in MyGov. So in other words, for someone who might still be using secret questions and answers to access MyGov, we're suggesting to them that's not a very safe way for you to access MyGov. It's very easy for you to be scammed if you do that. You should consider digital identity or pass keys, or at least changing to a password and regularly changing your password. So there's a maturity journey that's happening there, Julian, which is partly connected to people being safe, and then also partly connected to does it make it easier for you to get things done? And what I'd say on that front is we're really excited about some of the work that's been emerging, which I know you'd be familiar with, but which is around the use of verifiable credentials. And for the benefit of others who aren't familiar with that, but this is the idea of being able to have a trusted digital assertion of something that you could have in a wallet, for example, your digital wallet. You could have these things in your MyGov wallet, but you might, over time, these things might be in your Apple wallet, let's say. But that trusted digital assertion might be to prove who you are, to confirm that you are David Hazlehurst, but it could also be to prove something about you. The fact that you're of a certain age, for example, to get into a pub, or that you have a certain qualification, or are working with vulnerable people check, or a certain license. And that would be a way then of you being able to prove that without having to hand something over. Yes, I have the license to be a plumber, tick, without you needing to carrying around that hard copy piece of information, but in a way that can then be verified. So I'll just go one moment more on the technical side of that. But for example, that could include having a QR code that can be scanned and it goes back to source and confirms that, yes, legitimately, this person is a plumber, licensed to plumb in the ACT. So we're really excited about that. We've been doing some proofs of concept around that for proving you're over 18 to get into a pub without having to hand over your driver's license, or check into a hotel, or become a new patient in a medical practice. And we think there are big opportunities through the use of these verifiable credentials, which are also connected to a digital identity, to make things really easy for people and not have copies of their driver's license lying around in real estate offices, for example. So yeah, happy to go further on that stuff, Julian, but still some way to go. The last thing I'd say though, the private sector is innovating on this very rapidly. And the best thing government can do is to be providing that framework and infrastructure and doing things that make sense for government, and then letting the private sector operate within that framework. So I know that's what finance are leading on.
Just to go down that rabbit hole a little bit further, because it's one that really does affect people every day, especially when you have to deal with high levels of administration later in your life. Concessionality has always been one of the bugbears, like proving that you've got a concessional entitlement, and often that will come from something as simple as a healthcare card or that sort of thing. Has there been much progress there? Because it's great to talk about wallets, and who knows, Apple Wallet may soon be designated by the Reserve Bank of Australia, so whole different bunch of moving parts there. But will we ever get, in the future, a concessional entitlement into a digital wallet?
Yes. Yes, we will. And those are exactly the sorts of things that are relative, well, particularly for things like the cards that we administer, they are pretty straightforward over time for us to be able to put into a wallet, and to be able to then also make them verifiable. So not just an image of a card, but something that can be, if you like, scanned at the other end and confirm, no, this is the real deal. So the short answer to that is yes, those are some of the easier candidates because they're centrally administered, many of them, by Services Australia. Where it gets more complex, but not overwhelming, is things where you're looking at things like qualifications or licenses or permits, where, of course, there's not one central issuing authority for those. They're issued by all sorts of different institutions, and they need to come into that kind of safe, interoperable ecosystem. So I think those things are doable. They will happen at different rates in different jurisdictions. I wouldn't mind betting that Service New South Wales will be at the forefront of a lot of those things. But those are things that will happen over time too.
How good is the Federation, hey? Now, just in terms of some machinery of government stuff, because this kind of, came, not, I would say, out of left field, but, we weren't aware of it immediately. Finances, Services Australia has moved into the Department of Finance portfolio, and could you talk us through perhaps a little bit of the logic of going into finance, and does that mean that Services Australia could become, I guess, for want of a better description, like a central agency capability shop that delivers common services or products like call centre services that, are already white labelled by your august organisation?
Sure. So look, at one level, this was just a sort of obvious move, in the sense that having the Minister, of course, that we now do, Katie Gallagher, as the Minister for Finance, which includes digital and data, but also the Minister for Government Services and also the Minister for the Public Service, of which we're about 25% or 20%. There's some logic that's just simply based around her ministerial responsibilities. But going to your point, well, I should say at the outset, of course, it's the Prime Minister who decides these things, and we would make any arrangement work. But what I would say is that we already provide that kind of central capacity across government. So we have about 10 different other departments or agencies that we operate services for. And some of those do fall into the category of what you described as the white labeled, if you like. So most recently for the election. Many people who were ringing the Electoral Commission were in fact ringing us, and we were providing that service on their behalf. We will do similar things, including enabling people to do the next census through MyGov. We do things when DFAT has an emergency overseas. We are often then helping answer the phones for people who are trying to get back to Australia, for example. So that will continue, I think, Julian, but it's not that, as you say, it's not that that's a new thing. It's just that we'll be in a position to sort of further double down on that. I suppose the other observation is we also do things like co-location. We've got about 100 co-located sites with the NDIA, with DVA, and even with Service Tasmania. I do think it creates some better opportunities for us to even more closely collaborate with colleagues in the portfolio about digital and data. That's a big opportunity. And there's one extra bit which may not have been completely obvious, but actually turns out is really valuable for us and creates some opportunities for us to engage with Minister Gallagher. And that's her responsibility around deregulation or better regulation, which most of the time people think about in relation to business. But of course, we've also been able to say, well, there's a burden, there's a cost to Australians of interacting with us. And so if there's opportunities for us to do things differently or better, that reduces that burden. That's something that we can connect with our finance colleagues on. And for example, create opportunities for legislative change, which aren't big P policy changes. They're more fine tuning of particular acts that we work with our other policy departments on. But that could, for example, include things like having a common approach to nominees, having someone act on your behalf. And a legislative solution for that would enable us to reduce the burden on people having to have signal across all these different types of things that they're interacting with government, whether they want a nominee to act on their behalf. When we're thinking about this, and it's partly in the context too of the economic summit that's going to be happening very soon, we've also been toying with the idea within the agency of saying, well, should we have a metric about the number of hours we have saved people in terms of interacting with us? And it's consistent with the idea of helping Australians to get on with their lives, right? And so just two examples of that is we introduced place in queue telephony, so people get a call back instead of waiting on the call. And we've also introduced booked appointments. So you can book online instead of having to ring up to book an appointment or have to go into a service centre to book an appointment. They're not radical technologies, of course, but between the two of them, 500,000 booked appointments in the last less than 12 months, 1 million placing queue offerings. We reckon it's about 500,000 hours that we've saved Australians. And so to me, that's also part of being in the finance portfolio. That's part of the reducing the regulatory burden of interacting with government.
Okay, let's go to some questions that we've had. Many questions got sent in.
Sure.
A lot of them were kind of along a similar theme, but one of the big ones that got asked in a variety of ways is around artificial intelligence, how it's being used.
Sure.
Are there opportunities for personalised and contextual services? You know, are there risks? What's the vision? And what's happening with the legislation? So take some or any or all of those.
Yeah, sure. No, fine. I mean, not surprisingly, I get asked a lot, both within the organisation from our frontline staff and asked a lot from others outside the organisation about AI. And look, I generally say to people, we owe it to the public and we owe it to our staff to be engaging deeply on AI, but we're not going to rush and we're going to do it carefully. And against the backdrop of Robodebt, of course, we're going to try and do it as much as we can and always in the open. We don't want to have secret plans for things. And we're really trying to think through ways of doing it ethically, responsibly, all of the things that you would expect. Now, what I would say about that is if we don't have a foundation of trust for the way in which we go about deploying AI, both with our staff and with the public, we'll get ourselves into trouble. We are following all of the assurance frameworks that have been put in place by the government and by our colleagues in other agencies. We're following the voluntary AI ethics principles. We're following the responsible use of AI in government framework. We've published our automation and AI strategy. We're engaging deeply with the advisory board I mentioned earlier around the practices and the ethics of the different things we might consider doing. What I want to be super clear on is we have no plans for AI to be making decisions on people's entitlements. That is not something we are going to do. What we have done forever is have different kinds of automation, if A, then B, in the way in which we administer many payments. So, for example, the Medicare system has large amounts of automation in it. No one makes a decision when you go to the doctor and you get a Medicare rebate. You just get it automatically. But that's different from AI, of course. So when we're thinking about AI, we are thinking about ways in which we could help the public more easily navigate what are complex systems. And that includes, of course, how do we make sure that the content that we have out there that's consumed by Google or ChatGPT or Claude is accurate? Because many people will be getting their information increasingly over time from those digital assistants, not directly by going to our website. So that's a big thing for us to consider. Another kind of way in which we're thinking about is how do we help our staff to be more effective, to more easily understand the complex procedural guidance that we provide to them to administer the complex payments. Again, AI, particularly generative AI, can help with that. Like many other agencies, we're also just looking at generative AI tools, the ubiquitous ones. So whether it's Microsoft Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT, we are looking closely at how we can support our staff to be able to use those tools to make basic things easier to do. What I would say about all of this is, and I've said this before publicly, I've now had 3 occasions where I've been in a smart centre and on the same floor, 25 metres apart, I've had one staff member say, can you clowns just get on with it and make it easier for me to do this job better? Make it easier for me to do the simple things faster so I can spend more time on complex work and complex cases and help people who really need the most help. And 25 metres over there, another staff member in the same team will say to me, I'm really worried about losing my job. And both of those sentiments, both of those feelings are reasonable feelings to be feeling. And so for us as an agency, we need to engage with that sensitively, with optimism, not be about replacing staff, being about enabling them to do even better jobs, for us to get closer and closer and closer to the levels of performance we'd like to achieve across the board, and delivering better for customers. And look, lastly on all of this, in addition to the idea of being really open about how we're going about this, to talking with staff about what would you like, what would make you anxious, what would make you excited. We're also really conscious of just because we can doesn't mean we should. So the ethical considerations going to, should we actually do something? And the related but different idea around for our staff, but also for the public, the balance between doing something that's very clever and doing something that's creepy. And I say that because when people talk about hyper-personalized service, on the one hand, that can be really clever. But on the other hand, people talk about how does Facebook know X, Y, and Z? I don't want us to be creepy. So to the extent we might help people navigate the system, I want that to be in a form that is keeping pace with what people expect of us and not getting ahead of that.
That's a pretty comprehensive answer. I also understand, just to wrap it up today, and it's been great having you here, that you also managed to, I think you may have uttered these words at a different conference that we won't mention, that you may have made a little bit of AI redundant.
Did we?
Or switch some off in terms of candidate vetting and that improvement.
Well, I mean, effectively what we did was a tool that we could otherwise have used for doing the shortlisting of candidates, where we were expecting about 8,000 candidates for our APS 3 and 4 service officers. The tool couldn't tell us, to my satisfaction, why this candidate was shortlisted and this one wasn't. It's a pretty fundamental problem, actually. And I'm quite sure that this is a now thing rather than an always thing. I'm quite sure that that will be solved and we will be able to use a tool that can do that and help us with the shortlisting of that many candidates. We ended up with 14,000 candidates rather than 8. And we did it with humans. And what I've said to people about that is it took us longer. It involved additional resources that we could otherwise have put into other things. Did it give us a better result? I don't know. But the idea that there wouldn't be bias or error in humans making judgments around 14,000 candidates is probably a problem as well. So I guess a lot of the time the test for us is not just can we or should we, and whether the thing is transparent and can tell us why it achieves a certain result, but it's also, is it actually better? The test will also need to be, does it produce a better result or not? And so these sorts of judgments and trade-offs, I'm sure other agencies are challenged by the same sorts of issues, and we'll keep doing it across the board with any use of AI.
David, thanks so much again for joining us. That's been fantastic. It's been comprehensive and we've certainly covered a lot of ground. For the audience, a recording of this has been taken and will be made available in the future. So we'll let you know in your inboxes and on the site and various other channels when that all happens. Once again, David Hazlehurst, thank you very much for joining the Mandarin.
Great to have joined you. Thanks, Julian.